So John, tell me, what is the greatest Nintendo system of all time? Or video game system of all time if you want to be if you want to be broader.
Well, we've never discussed this ever. Definitely not 5 minutes before we went live here, but it's absolutely the GameCube.
It is the best. Now, I don't know how much of this is like truly nostalgia. Do you really think it's really nostalgia how much the GameCube is like so cool and so like good in terms of the library, just everything about it, the controller, the design, just how the games looked, how the game sounded, all of it. It just feels it's just my favorite Nintendo system. But I'm kind of like figuring out like, do you think it's nostalgia or do you think it's actually like really that good if it's really that up there?
I think there is. I mean, there's nostalgia definitely because if you compare it to games now, visually speaking, it's nowhere near them. But I think there was just this charm about Nintendo at that time in the early 2000s with their first party games, and even some of the third party stuff that just felt very much Nintendo, I guess is the only way you can describe it. So you still have games that there's nothing like them still to this day. So it's an easy generation for me anyway to go back to because it's not like the chunky 3D visuals that we had when we were first moving to 3D with the N64 and the PS1. So they're tolerable, and the GameCube puts out some pretty good visuals through an HDMI adapter with that digital port on the back to where it's still good enough. But I will say, if you can get a CRT TV, and I know you hear this from people a lot, like get a CRT, the GameCube at that time actually comes through pretty good on one of those still.
I think it holds up the best. I mean, like next to the Xbox, like whenever I play the PS2 these days, like it's rough. That thing does not output necessarily very well.
Yeah.
Even through dirty old composite or something, it still looks pretty okay for composite. This game system still looks pretty good today. 3D models and all of that, obviously outdated. It doesn't hold up in every way, but I think from like an aesthetic point of view, from an art design point of view, most of the games I think still look quite good. You look at something like Mario Sunshine, even like Wind Waker, specifically Wind Waker is like the best looking game from that generation, I'd say, today.
That art style, though, helps a lot with that because at that time, the PS2 and the Xbox, they were trying to cater to a more mature audience. And because of that, they tried to go more realistic at a time when we weren't quite there yet. We got much closer with the 360 and the PS3, and then I think we're basically there now, where you can have games that, I mean, are as close to cinema in the movie theater experiences as we are, at all. So at that time, I think Nintendo did a good job going with those art styles that, lent more into like the cartoony style 80%, 90% of the time. But something like Wind Waker still looks great now. You can fire it up and you're like, oh, wow, this works. All right.
Yeah, I think there's very little that really needed to be updated. It's wild to think like that was the game that they initially were like, hey, let's do an HD remaster of this back on Wii U, because like out of all the Zelda titles, it probably needed it the least, but it looked the best when it brought into HD without very little like effort put into it. And they still put a lot of effort into that HD remaster, but like when you look back at the original GameCube one, it's easy to forget how good that original game still looked. And, Wind Waker may be an outlier just because of the art style, but, games like Mario Sunshine, Metroid Prime, I think games back then, they just understood 3D visuals and they understood how to get the most out of, like, art design and all of that, to the point where, these games are still in 4x3. They may be a little blocky in various cases and have lower end textures, but, like, they still look like they're never unplayable. They always look like they have their own style, and I think the GameCube just holds up tremendously well today. But back in the day, how was the GameCube as a player back then? Because I had the GameCube as a very young kid. That was like my first game console. So while I understood a lot of its shortcomings back then, I didn't really understand like a lot of the really massive ones. I understood it couldn't play DVDs, but I kind of looked at it like, what are you saying the third-party support is bad? Like, it's just like, I'm getting all these games, and they were all like, whatever, the licensed kids games, pretty much, because that's what I was playing back then. But as somebody who was a bit older back then, how do you how do you remember it back in the day as a video game player?
It was definitely not seen as mature as the PS2 or the Xbox, and it did miss when you mentioned the third party stuff. It missed some fairly large games like Grand Theft Auto wasn't there. That was probably the biggest one where you're like, oh well, the PlayStation has it and the Xbox eventually got it and the GameCube doesn't have it. Oh well, there's a reason for that in their mind, is because the GameCube isn't really catering to the same audience. But I actually thought one of the bigger titles that they missed out on was Final Fantasy X, because that came out relatively earlier in the PS2's life, and there are a few games I think back on that really made you feel like you were going into the next generation, and that was probably the one. Like when you got Final Fantasy X and you fired it up and they hit you with that initial cutscene with Tidus and about to play Blitzball, and then it transitioned, not seamlessly, but close enough to where you're like, okay, these in-game models still look really good. That was kind of the moment to me that kicked things off. But the GameCube was seen as the younger system, and that was the system I first had back then. I didn't own a PS2. My cousin did, and I'd play it at their place, and we went over there quite a bit. But the GameCube was my first, like, this is my system from this generation. And all my friends had PS2 and Xbox, and I was the GameCube kid. But even then, as like 12 or 13, it wasn't necessarily a system you had a lot of people to talk to about it, because I think I was the only one in my group of friends that had it at first, and then one of my other friends got it. So I would sit there and talk about some of these games, like a Mario Sunshine, but the only one that really, I think, got people's interest was probably Metroid Prime, because that was the other game that I was thinking of that made me feel like the GameCube, you could just walk up to people and say, have you seen this game? This game looks incredible. It's Metroid Prime. And it legitimately looked better than, I think, anything, even Halo, the original Halo. Metroid Prime had some moments, especially with weather and environments and them playing around with the visor that would fog up or freeze a little bit. And it was so fluid that was the game that I think put the GameCube a bit over some of those systems at that time in terms of visuals. But it was certainly not a system you ran around talking to everyone about. It wasn't until later, and really 5 or 6, maybe even 7 years ago, when all of a sudden the GameCube started to spike in popularity. And I think that's just because we all got older and we're now looking back on getting our childhood systems.
Well, you can't play a lot of these games anywhere else still. Most of these games like that you really do remember from the GameCube and are these system-defining titles are still only available on GameCube. A lot of the Nintendo stuff, but a lot of the third-party stuff as well, and even multi-platform stuff. Still, like the GameCube, I don't know. I'd say like on GameCube, a lot of those games, even if like let's say the Xbox or PS2 version has exclusive features, or the Xbox version probably would run better. I just feel like the GameCube is still like the most accessible to just plug in, play right away, no issue, just immediately. The controller, I love it. I just always preferred playing a lot of those games on that system. But there wasn't a ton of those games. It always felt like a lot of series would try like 1 or 2 entries on GameCube and then kind of give up, or they try like a random one in the middle, like the Burnout games. You got 1, 2, and then after that, none of them. After the Burnout series actually got really good and really popular, that's when they were like, no Burnout 3, and nothing after that. We got an exclusive Metal Gear Solid. It was a remake, but still,
Twin Snakes.
Yeah, but no Metal Gear Solid 2, no Metal Gear Solid 3. Do you know of any like reason why they went for like a remake of the first game rather than like 2 or 3? Was it because of hardware limitations, because of like the disc size, or because Nintendo commissioned or like went to Konami about this?
I don't think it was any real technical limitations. I think because it was Silicon Knights did it. Yeah. So apparently they had one of the people the director of that studio had a relationship, I believe, with Kojima, and they got together and they were trying to come up with ways to make that work, and they decided to make this on the GameCube. But that was always a weird one to me with that situation, because 2 was huge when that came out. It was this massive deal, and eventually to go to the Xbox, which was good to see that as well. But it was kind of strange. I think the problem they ran into with Metal Gear Solid 3 is that the GameCube just wasn't selling like the PS2, and to the point where they weren't sure if it was worth even doing it, so they just went with one system with the PS2 at the time and just developed for that. Because like, even I remember when Resident Evil 4 got announced, and that was legitimately surprising to people, because they're like, oh, it's the GameCube's getting Resident Evil 4. How is that happening? And we know it's because Nintendo and Capcom came up with a deal for a bunch of games, and that was one of them. But because it's this hard M-rated Resident Evil game that's exclusive to the system with a handle, this cube, it was a really weird thing to people at that time. So I think there was I think Nintendo was harder to work with back then. I will say that there's a lot of history behind them not even sending out dev kits until after the system was out. Those kind of things that I think really hurt relations with developers, and it's pretty well documented. There's even more recent articles, as I think it's like 2 or 3 years ago, detailing some of these shortcomings for Nintendo with developer relations then, which have gotten a lot better now. I will say that, but it was a tough time for developers then with the GameCube and just trying to make something work with it.
Yeah, well, the GameCube had a lot of shortcomings in the form of barely any online multiplayer. It had it.
Yeah.
You could do it on there, but you could buy the broadband adapter, and it pretty much only worked with Phantasy Star Online, and that was pretty much it. Outside of LAN play for games like Mario Kart and Kirby Air Ride. But outside of that, like, it just wasn't used, which kind of makes you wonder, like, why did Sega put Phantasy Star Online on the GameCube? I think the reasoning was they said, like, oh, well, it's structurally very similar to the Dreamcast, but it's just like there's barely any online multiplayer connectivity on this system, so why put this online focused game on here? It eventually went to Xbox, but
I know people who played it on the Xbox. I didn't know anyone who played it on the GameCube. I remember getting it because it had like the single player component, but I'd never heard of anyone really going online with it that much. So I don't really know why they did that. That was a very strange one. At least the Xbox already had an Ethernet port on it out of the box. You didn't have to buy this $150 or something attachment for your system.
Yeah, it's very strange because Nintendo seems very stubborn about evolving and changing and kind of like going with the flow, kind of just following in the footsteps of like other companies. It feels like they very much want to be kind of the pioneer of certain things, and they weren't for online multiplayer, so they were just kind of like, no. Like, I remember like a quote from them at that time was just like, people don't want to play online. Like, they were just like, no. But now, and I think they said a very similar thing about DLC. They were like, we're never going to do paid DLC. We want our games to be complete. And now, in this year, we're getting a bunch of games from Nintendo that are so focused on online multiplayer and are so reliant on downloadable content and updates and all of that stuff. It's
a subscription service even now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty wild to see how eventually they do kind of get into that kind of stuff. But they are usually pretty stubborn about those things at first. And I think that really did kind of hurt them with the GameCube. But it's interesting to kind of just think about, like, what could they have really done differently with the GameCube to kind of make it a huge success? Because I'm not really sure how much they really could have done, considering the Xbox was pretty much everything, like, had pretty much everything with it, and it barely did better than the GameCube. And that could probably be a testament to the fact that, Microsoft, it was a brand new thing. This was the first Xbox. Microsoft had never done a game console before this. So, Nintendo and Sony at least had that brand recognition. But with Sony, the original PlayStation sold 100 million out the gate. So I don't really think that's a problem. So it's kind of interesting. I feel like no matter what Nintendo would have done, this was Sony's generation to win.
I think Nintendo ran into issues, like I said, with developers, but also with they just, for some reason, they desperately wanted to be different when they didn't have to with their disc reader. I don't know why they refused to do anything with DVD playback. It was so weird. Even at the time, it was like, oh, why does the GameCube use these little discs? And then sometimes you'd buy a third-party game, and it would have 2 mini DVDs in there because it couldn't fit it on one of them, and it's so strange.
Oh man, when like Tiger Woods PGA Tour like 2005 had 2 discs, and it's just like, man, what are we doing here? This is getting ridiculous.
I've wondered if that would have helped. I mean, I assume it would have, because then they could have advertised that they have that DVD functionality. But I mean, the GameCube was so cheap even at the time, and maybe that's one of the reasons they were able to make it so cheap, is because it didn't have DVD playback or something. I'm not sure, but it was, they had it down to $100 or something later in its generation. It still wasn't selling, so it has to be an image problem, or I don't know. But you also got to think of the momentum that Sony had, as you mentioned, of the PS1 generation, coming out of that, showing up out of a failed partnership with Nintendo, vastly outselling the Nintendo 64, and then rolling into the PS2 generation with full backwards compatibility for games that you already had on the PS1. So it was probably a fairly easy transition for PlayStation owners to move to that PS2 because their games all still worked. So in that sense, you replace your PS1 with a PS2, you have DVD capabilities now, you have this new library, and all your PS1 discs just work. You pop them in and they go.
Yeah, so either way, like, I feel like there wasn't a lot Nintendo could have done differently with the GameCube. Where it's just like, yeah, including DVD playback, probably would have sold a couple more million consoles, but I don't think it would have sold nearly as much as the PlayStation 2, because like you said, Sony had so much momentum going in from the PS1. You know, they sold so many systems, so many people had so many games for that, and then you have this PS2. Not only does it play DVD movies, but you can play all your PS1 games, so it's instantly kind of attractive to an install base of 100 million players. And I think that was really important, whereas with the GameCube, it just kind of felt like, oh, the cheap console for kids, where, you know, it wasn't always that, but that's just like based on everything Nintendo did with it. It just kind of ended up getting that reputation, because the only games that really made sense to bring to it were like a lot of licensed kids games and games that had that colorful, cartoony style that kind of appealed to pre-existing Nintendo fans. So at least like back in the day, when I had the GameCube, like I got it when I was around like 6, maybe 7. So I was the prime demographic, the target demographic for such a baby system. But I got that with the Game Boy player initially. That was the only thing I got with my GameCube, was the Game Boy player.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was, which, I mean, hey, if Sony sold like all those PS2s to 100 million PS1 owners, you'd think Nintendo would have been able to sell that GameCube to the hundreds of millions of people who own Game Boy systems. But I think the Game Boy player was put out around like 2003 or so, and it felt like Nintendo was just trying to add that much more value to the GameCube, and I think they really did. This is like one of the best accessories Nintendo has ever released for anything. And that was pretty much all I used my GameCube for the first couple months. Was just
it was just a Game Boy.
Yeah, it was just a way to play Game Boy games on my TV. It did the job. It was pretty good. I still use the Game Boy Play. Well, I haven't been using it recently because I have the Analog Pocket, and I just kind of hooked that up to the TV, which is it works very well. But yeah, I think that was at least like one of the when that's only one of the reasons why I think the GameCube was really like one of the most like bang for your buck Nintendo systems. That says something, because I think like the library as a whole, you just have like all major Nintendo franchises represented, and on top of that you do have like a decent amount of third-party support. It's not really like everything that you could have possibly wanted, but there was at least like games from various different series represented there. There was enough different genres, but you know, in the end, I feel like there were still a lot of gaps in the library. But if you owned a GameCube at the time, it kind of forced you to try playing games that maybe you weren't playing, or just games that a lot of other GameCube players were playing at the time. And I think that kind of creates this sense of community between people who owned a GameCube. Like, it's just like, oh yeah, we all played these games. Whereas like PlayStation 2 owners, they had like 2,000 games to pick from. So, you know, like everybody played different games.
I'm trying to think of the first games I was really playing on the GameCube. I think I feel like one was Luigi's Mansion, and it's funny. I remember the GameCube first came out, and I didn't get it initially when it first came out, because basically you'd have to wait for me anyway, Christmas or birthday at that time to get the big item. And unfortunately, my birthday is right around Christmas time, so they weren't able to find one that year, and I think I just got more games for some of my other stuff. It might have been N64 and Dreamcast Christmas that year, but it was the following Christmas that I did get the GameCube, so I was like a year late to it or so. But being, you know, like 12 or 13, getting the GameCube even then is a big deal, right? You know, getting in on the ground floor for the generation. And I remember, I think the day after Christmas, I went to the store, because that's what happens. If you got a system at Christmas and you're missing something, you had to sit there and wait until the next day when the stores would reopen. Nowadays, they just make these big retail stores make the employees go in. It's Christmas, who cares? Get in there. But back then, you had to wait. So if you needed batteries, well, you're just going to sit there and look at your systems. Or I'm sorry, we would read the manuals, things that would come with games back then. Anyway, we would basically have to hang out with our system until it was time to go to the store the next day. And I believe the first game I purchased for the GameCube with my own money, which was birthday money at the time, was Smash Brothers Melee. And a great game, big time game then. There was so much content to that title.
That was the killer app. That was like the thing that you really could, if you owned a PS2 or Xbox, you really couldn't be like, oh, well, I have kind of an alternative to that on my systems. Like, no, there was nothing else like Smash Brothers at the time. Still really isn't, you know, like Smash Brothers will always be kind of like it's the Mario Kart of its own genre of like party fighter game.
I remember I got it, and because I was playing it a lot, I played it a lot on the Nintendo 64. Like, we were on the school bus trading secrets about how to unlock Luigi and Captain Falcon and stuff for the 64 version. But I got it on the GameCube, and I'm playing it, and I remember you can pause the game, and when you do, it zooms in on your character, and you can see all the detail. And I'm sitting there for had to have been 5 or 10 minutes in the middle of a match with my brothers, and I'm like, hold on, look at Mario's buttons. It's like you can see like all the spots like sewn in and stuff. Like, this is mind-blowing stuff. So we had Smash Brothers Melee then. But I think the games that I got, because the first game I remember playing on the GameCube, it wasn't my GameCube, it was the kiosk at McDonald's. When it first came out, they installed kiosks at McDonald's. They replaced the Nintendo 64 ones, and that was Luigi's Mansion, because that launched with the GameCube. But they must have had some deal with McDonald's or something, I don't know. But they were showing it off there.
The GameCube always felt like the prime like dentist office game console, or just like something that like everybody, like anybody that owned a business could just buy, and they could be like, we'll just set this up for the kids to play. But those were more so for like advertising purposes. And I remember they kept those up for quite a while after. Like, there's probably some random McDonald's out there that still have like these set up, and they're just absolutely torn to bits, absolutely disgusting. But yeah, the launch titles, I remember like the GameCube had 2 Nintendo published launch titles. You got Wave Race and Luigi's Mansion, and both are great games, but both are also kind of like, like, okay, these do for launch, but they were both pretty like pretty short games. Luigi's Mansion was mainly single player and isn't only single player and very short. And then Wave Race was still kind of like, what you see is what you get with Wave Race. Very good, but but you also got like Super Monkey Ball. You got Crazy Taxi, and a couple of the sports games at the time, a bunch of licensed games. And then you got like Melee and Pikmin 1 a couple weeks later. But I feel like the GameCube also had a couple like months where there just wasn't much going on. And this was already like 2 years into the PS2's life. And I think Sony kind of had that year head start. Yep. And Xbox had Halo launch with its system around the exact same time as the GameCube launch.
I think the other games that I got though, they weren't even Nintendo games. One was well, kind of. I mean, I was kind of in collaboration with Nintendo. One was Rogue Squadron,
Mm-hmm.
which the thing that with this game, and kind of with the other one too, the other one was WrestleMania 18 X8. Loved all the wrestling games back then. I played them so much on the PS2 and then the GameCube. And I remember the big thing then, which is funny to look back on now, coming from the Nintendo 64, where I had like No Mercy and WrestleMania 2000 and those, going to the GameCube, having full motion video play on the Titantrons was the biggest mind-blowing event to me ever. It's like, oh my gosh, look at this. There's that actual video in the game. And they did the same thing with Rogue Squadron. When you first turned that game on, it was like parts of the movie playing on the title screen. And when you blew up the Death Star, they did that quick cut transition to the scene from the movie with it blowing up. And I was like, this is it. It's never getting any better. We have actual full motion video that doesn't look terrible like the Sega CD in the game. This is impressive stuff.
Hey, I think Star Wars Rogue Squadron still looks damn good today.
Oh yeah. It looks good, runs well, yeah.
Yeah, it looks, I mean, like, there are certain times where, like, just the way the shadows look and just the way everything kind of just, like, moves, it looks so similar to the actual movies. It's pretty wild how they were able to pull that off back in 2001. But, yeah, I mainly had, I think, like, one of my first games, this is really rough because one of my first games for the GameCube back then, you know, mainly had to play Game Boy games on it. And then one of my first games was Sonic Mega Collection, which is, again, like, barely...
I had that one.
Yeah, well, barely anything that's actually like, oh, man, 3D and actual see what the GameCube can do. But it just kind of felt like a lot of these video game compilations at the time had so much more, like, love put into them, feeling like more so actual releases rather than just a vessel to put out new games or old games on new systems. I just have like a ton of memories with that one, just how everything is like presented. It just feels really good. There wasn't a ton. I only had like a handful of GameCube games as a kid. Most of my experience came from like playing at friends' houses. That's where we'd play like Smash Brothers Melee and Mario Kart and all those games. Eventually bought like Mario Sunshine from a friend, and you know, there was just so much stuff that I didn't experience until years later. And now it's kind of like overwhelming just the amount of good content on the GameCube. And I think a lot of other people notice that with just how expensive this all is.
Well, it doesn't help that they didn't sell a lot of systems technically. So even the systems get out there, but then you also have to consider that influences how many copies of games they actually put out into the market. So we're already fighting for a limited supply of them then technically, but definitely now. So prices have only jumped further and further. And like there were times, I remember with Gotcha Force, I was really trying to decide if I wanted to buy the thing. I'm like, I don't know. It's like $200 for this game, but it is part of the collection, and I feel like it'll go. Now it's like, this game's like $800. I'm like, wow, I did not expect. I mean, it's good that I guess I bought it then, or like Pokemon XD was $50 back then. Now it's 4 times that. I mean, it's weird stuff, but people fighting over a limited supply of games, and the games themselves, I think, are just very intriguing to people right now.
I remember like a couple years into the Wii's life, even like around like when the 8th generation started, I believe you could get a GameCube for like $20-$30.
Yep.
Pretty easy.
It was cheap.
Mainly because like everybody technically already kind of had a GameCube with the Wii. People still kind of already have a GameCube with the Wii. How much do like Wii systems go for these days? Like original Wii systems?
They're like $70 or $80, I think now.
Yeah, they're getting a little up there too, just because like so many people ended up going like just like, oh man, I remember this, I want to play it again. So like there's just more demand, and that's really cool. I think it's kind of like a balancing act where it's just like, this is really cool. I love seeing people kind of like get into the hobby of just looking back at older games and just enjoying like collecting all this stuff. I think it's a really great hobby to get into, but it also drives up the price like mad, and it is very overwhelming. You have been chipping away at like a complete GameCube set. How is that going?
I'm working at it. Pretty good. I've been buying games here and there that, and some of them I didn't even realize released on the GameCube. Like recently, I got Hitman 2, and I didn't even realize that released on the GameCube, because back then I had it on the original Xbox. I didn't even think to check for it on the GameCube at that time, because as I mentioned, there was kind of that image of the GameCube, and I'm like, I don't even know if this is out on that. I saw it on the store shelf. I wanted the new Hitman game. I'll just get it on the Xbox. That's fine. But like stuff like that is pretty cool to just come across. And then the thing with that is that when I go to conventions or other means on eBay and stuff, it's quickly gone from I'm gonna buy 5 or 6 GameCube games that are much more reasonably priced to where I'm getting more and more down to, I guess I'm gonna buy 1 GameCube game, because they're just you get to the point where I don't find a reason to buy sports games on eBay because the shipping ends up being the same as the game itself. I'd rather buy those at a convention. But then on the other hand, the more expensive games I've bought, I'm gonna say at least 2 that were like $70 or $80 range, and I get it. The person's like, mint condition. I get it. I flip it over. I'm like, there's scratches all over this thing. What is this? So it's this weird thing where I go on eBay and I look for the $20 or $30 games where I'm like, I'll take a chance on this. But anything more than that, I kind of want to see in person before I put the money down. So it's getting harder as I continue to shrink down the overall size. Also, I got to figure out a way to inventory this stuff. I'm realizing that too. Other than taking a picture of my shelf and occasionally zooming back in looking for it, I need to get like an inventory app or something.
Yeah, I've tried doing that in the past. Where like I'll find like those like apps that are like, oh, collecting apps and all that, and you get to put all that stuff in, and that'll like keep me busy for a couple hours one day, but then I forget to do it later. I'm just like, yeah, I'll do this later. But yeah, that is probably a good thing, because like, yeah, when you go out to different stores, sometimes like I'll buy games that I completely forgot I already owned. It's getting to that sad point where it's just like, oh man, I'm like, I forgot I even owned this game. And yeah, I've been chipping away, getting more and more GameCube stuff, just because I find that I prefer playing it. That's my preferred way to play a lot of those games from that generation. I originally kind of had the collecting mindset of, if I'm going to buy a multi-platform game from the 6th generation, I will get the Xbox version because it is generally the best. But
sure.
I just find myself more likely and more willing to play a multi-plat game from that generation if I'm playing the GameCube version, just because like that's just the control I prefer, that's the system I prefer, all of that. So I've been just buying more and more stuff, even if I have it on the original Xbox. I've been picking up the GameCube version, and the shelf is starting to fill up quite a bit.
I think I like the GameCube case more than the other two as well. And if I really sit down and put them all next to each other, the Xbox case, for some reason, like the original Xbox, just felt cheap to me. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't mind that it's green, but it just felt very plasticky.
It's just very Mountain Dew green, and just
yeah.
It's also I don't know. I find that a lot of times, like if you buy a used original Xbox game, it'll come in a 360 case or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, I'm like, okay, well, I'll take it, but like,
If you get that authentic Nintendo GameCube case, and it just feels higher quality too. I don't know if it's thicker plastic or because it has to support the smaller disc that you drop into it, but there is a satisfying click when you put it into the case.
Well, I do not recall getting any GameCube game with like a chipped case, like a case with like the top where it's just like, oh man, like plastic's missing, it's cracked or anything like that. I don't really remember getting any GameCube game that looks like that. PS2 and Xbox, like I have a good few couple of games just
Sure.
like that.
I'll tell you, when they try to pull that thing where they put the GameCube game in a basic replacement case, that's the worst.
Oh, that's just
that happens.
That's how you know you don't want to. You're never coming back to that place.
Yeah.
Never coming back to them.
I need the legit Nintendo GameCube case. Okay, that's it. Just stacks really nicely on the shelf. I don't know. It just goes, unless you get that player's choice one.
Yeah, that's pretty rough. I have 2 right now. One I can't go without, mainly because it's Pac-Man World 2 plus Pac-Man Versus, and that only released as a player's choice, unfortunately.
Which one, I guess, is your least favorite then? I think Xbox had like the Platinum kind of title. The GameCube or the PS2 had like the red, the greatest hits, and the GameCube had the player's choice. Which one is the most annoying to you to look at on the shelf?
Here's the thing. I mean, like from that generation or just in general? Because I have a general one.
I guess from that generation specifically, like you line them up and they're all, let's just say this, picture your shelf complete collection of GameCube games, but for some reason you have one that's player's choice. Do the same thing on the Xbox, same thing on the PS2. Which one makes you the most mad?
Here's the thing. It's a little tricky because Xbox is like the whole damn case is a different color. It's and like the spine entirely is like this entirely different thing, whereas GameCube, like, yeah, the yellow is annoying, but it's also kind of like they don't do anything more than that. And in some ways, you know, like, you kind of look at that and you're just like, you know what? Like, it looks kind of cool. I had my copy of Sonic Mega Collection when I was younger was a player's choice version. And that game kind of had, like, a bit of a yellow aesthetic on the spine, either way, from what I remember. So it's kind of like, that's fine. I originally had, like, Crazy Taxi on the GameCube, and that was a player's choice. Well, I still have it, but I don't have the player's choice version anymore. And that entire spine, like, the Crazy Taxi spine was yellow. And then, you know, the player's choice bottom was yellow, too. So it's just like, it almost felt like it was, you know, it was Destiny.
Yeah, I did get to a point where I had to buy a couple games again because one was a player's choice. I was like, can't do it. Can't do this.
I definitely prefer. The only other one that I have that's still player's choice is Four Swords Adventures. Just because I'm just like, I just haven't gotten around to getting a different one. And it's pretty rough when, like, I only have 2 games that are player's choice across like over 100 regular GameCube games, so it's just a sea of black spines, and then just 2. PS2's just looks really, like, I just think it looks ugly. It's not like it looks boring. It looks like an old person's game system. The Burgundy, whatever, greatest hits. I would say God, that's tricky. They all are horrible in their own special ways.
Yeah, I know.
Damn. Well, the GameCube one sticks out the most. The GameCube one sticks out immediately the most, but I think those are probably, like, if you're going through for like a complete set of nothing but player's choice, like, that could be kind of fun. That could be kind of fun if you're doing the entire thing. But my least favorite in general is, have you ever seen, like, Xbox 360 games that are platinum hits?
Yeah, those look weird.
I mean, like, they have, like, a couple different variants of them, where, like, for a little bit there, I had, like, a platinum hit Skyrim, and, like, the spine was, you know, longer than usual. Like, it's Xbox 360 Platinum hits. And then the gradient went from, like, gray to white, so you couldn't even read the rest of the logo. And then the spine showing the game logo was just nothing but pure white with, like, Arial text that said The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. And I'm just like, I don't know what they were doing with this one. And, like, they weren't consistent throughout that entire generation. They just had weird versions of Platinum hits. They had, like, 3 different versions of Platinum hits games, but I digress.
What's the take on the handle for the GameCube?
Oh, it's great. It's unnecessary, but I think it completes the image. Have you ever tried photoshopping a GameCube to not have the handle?
I mean, I can technically take it off and take a picture. I thought about that, just removing the handle and taking a picture of it to see what people would say
it looks
online.
Naked. It doesn't look right.
I'm not gonna say anything about it. I would just take a picture of it on the like standing up, kind of, and I would put no message and just see what people say.
Yeah, it's something where, like, technically speaking, it should look fine, but we're so used to it with the handle that it looks wrong. And you don't really think about it, but it's just like, yeah, pretty much whenever I do carry the GameCube around, I do use the handle. It does come in handy.
I think I used it twice, maybe back in the day, to be honest.
I mean, like, you're going out of your way to think of it. Let's imagine you're bringing the GameCube over to, like, your workbench. You're gonna work on it. Are you really carrying it? Like,
that's true. No, now I'm swinging this thing around.
Yeah. Probably going to be holding it by the handle. But, I mean, we talked a little bit about how it's just like, oh, what if the GameCube had DVD playback? It technically kind of did with one model. I have over there,
the Q.
In the corner of my eye, I have the Panasonic Q. I did recently test that out, and yeah, my version works. Haven't tried out DVDs with it yet, but my version works. And yeah, it's a very cool piece of hardware. Very easy to see why it did not come over to the States, and very easy to see why it did not help the GameCube very much.
No, it really didn't.
It's literally a GameCube and DVD player duct taped together, pretty much. That's what it is.
Panasonic they were trying some things apparently, but it did not work. Cool piece for the collection, but that's kind of it. It's no, not much other reason to really own it, I guess, other than say, hey, look, I can put a DVD, but it's like region locked to the DVD. I think in Japan. I don't know if you can completely region free that thing, but I don't know. It's a cool piece of history, I guess, but it's up there to me with like the PSX, the DVR for the PlayStation, something like that.
At least the Panasonic Q works. The PSX is like that thing. It is impossible to find one that is in working condition. I think you can probably find some that maybe turn on, but outside of that, they ain't gonna do much outside of that. But I always thought that was like really cool. Have you ever seen like the cars with the little DVD player built in with like a Game Boy Advance also built in?
Yeah, I've seen pictures of it online. I've never like witnessed one working.
Well, I had a friend that had one installed in his car. He never made a big deal about it. Yeah, I was just like,
how do you not make a big deal about that? That's the first thing you say when you meet somebody,
he was just like,
right?
oh yeah, this was like my dad's old car, or my, this was like my parents' old car, and I just got it when I got my license.
That's the first thing you say. You introduce yourself, and then you say, I have a Game Boy Advance in my car.
Well, that's what I did. I made a video on the game. I made a Scott the Waz episode on the Game Boy Advance, and I was just like, how do I end this thing? Oh yeah, I have a friend with a Game Boy car, so I'll just incorporate that somehow. I've seen it a couple places here and there. I saw it on like eBay once, and at like Too Many Games another time. But yeah, it's just like, I think Nintendo was just making some moves with just incorporating their brands in a couple different places like that. I wish they would do that now. That would be a cool thing if there was like a Switch, like there was a Nintendo Switch branded.
You just put the cartridge in your dashboard.
That'd be pretty cool. But overall, what would you say is like the top games to get on the GameCube these days? Like get, play, enjoy, all of that. Even if they've been re-released elsewhere, in a lot of cases, like games still play the best on the GameCube. Like you look at Tales of Symphonia Remastered is coming out on Nintendo Switch, and in many ways you can say the GameCube one is still superior.
Yep, best one. I can't believe what they've done. Travesty what they've done to that game. The GameCube one though, I would say that's a good one. 60 FPS on the GameCube, art style carries through. Yeah, put that out there. Let me think. Soul Calibur 2 because Link is in it, and I think the game still holds up and looks great today.
Oh, for sure.
It's very fluid.
It's such a shame that Soul Calibur 3 was a PS2 exclusive after that.
Yeah, the guest character thing was really cool. I like that they got a different character for each system, and really everyone felt kind of unique that way. It was cool. You
know what was a real shame was they did Soul Calibur 2 HD, and were the guest characters still like exclusive to like Xbox and PlayStation?
Yeah, they had to remove. I feel like they had to remove most. Maybe Spawn was still in there. I know Link wasn't in it. But.
Yeah, well that was kind of my point. How it's just like that was released around the time, like that was released like 2013. So the Wii U was a thing, and like it didn't come to the Wii U. That was just like, oh man, like that would have been so cool to see that come back with Link in tow. But yeah, definitely one of the coolest games. Soul Calibur was genuinely like the premier, like, oh my god, you gotta get this, like this is like what shows off how great these new systems are. Just it did that for Dreamcast, and then it was this awesome experience across all the platforms on PS2, Xbox, and GameCube with Soul Calibur 2. And then after that, it kind of just, like Soul Calibur just isn't as big of a deal as it once was, which is a shame because it's still, it's still, I think it's one of the most accessible and fun fighting game series for like just anybody to play, whether it's like hardcore or casual. If you want to button mash, it's still a pretty fun time. So, but yeah, that is for sure a must-have on GameCube.
That I have Day of Reckoning 2. It's a wrestling game. I think it's a very good wrestling game. At the time, they were doing a lot with the SmackDown series on the PS2, but they switched over to the Day of Reckoning series after WrestleMania 19, and then they built on top of the first one that was very good with 2, and I think that's one of the better wrestling games for that generation overall. And it's exclusive to the GameCube, so that's the only place you can technically play it. But it was a very good wrestling game. It had actually an interesting story too. I mean, the stories in those games typically aren't very good. But it was, I guess, in terms of bad stories across the board for these wrestling games, that was like in the top tier for it. That one was very good though. And I'm gonna throw Star Fox Adventures in there.
The Star Fox Adventures. So you were on the you were on the message boards back then. So it's just like you knew what the takes were back then, and in terms of just like how people were feeling. like how were people feeling about that one back in the day? Did you have the same kind of level of like kind of like this isn't what I asked for, or were you always kind of like this is a good game?
I liked Wind Waker. I did. So that was the one that I think at the time was the most controversial. I liked Star Fox Adventures back then too, but people didn't like it because it wasn't a Star Fox game. And at the time, I feel like it wasn't as well known that it wasn't originally a Star Fox game. I think that came out a little later, but it was pretty obvious that it wasn't the traditional Star Fox game. And I was okay with it after I played it. I thought at the time we were really pushing for visuals, and that was a pretty big graphical leap from the Nintendo 64, and it ran really well. It was like 60 FPS and even had the fur physics and stuff. So it had, in that sense, I think Rare did a really good job with it. I don't know if the gameplay is going to hold up now, but I still think it's a pretty cool snapshot in time for what was possible on a technical level back then.
It feels like a game prime for a remake, just like kind of a touch up in terms of just like kind of modernizing the feel of it, because from what I've played, like it's a very great looking game with a ton of just like good ideas and design elements, but it feels like it just kind of needs that little just like tweak of kind of modern controls, just kind of like that.
I think the way you can take Star Fox now and move it to the next level with a new concept is to legitimately take Star Fox Adventures and Star Fox Assault or Zero, whatever, the traditional Star Fox, and just mash them together. I feel like they could probably do something with that, but that's we'll see about that. Star Fox Adventures I think is pretty good. Mario Strikers is good, and something a little different. I'll throw Sega Soccer Slam in there.
Sega Soccer Slam, yeah, two arcade soccer games.
Yeah, those were good back then.
I think Mario Strikers was just this really wacky idea back then. It was really cool to see like how much they were just that still might be the only Nintendo system with like all 4 of those Mario sports just all represented. You got golf, tennis, baseball, and strikers.
But some of the best versions. Baseball is awesome. Baseball's really good.
Yeah, it just kind of felt like they were it felt like they just kind of accepted how like the GameCube was kind of the big local multiplayer system. That was where you went for local multiplayer. So that's where they were like, all right, let's just throw it all in here. Let's do 15 Mario parties. Why not? Which they had that was their yearly franchise back then. It's crazy to look back at because like now
weird.
Like, we got Super Mario Party, and then what? Like 3 years later, we got another Mario Party that is a remake of mini games and boards from previous versions. So it's just like, but they really got the most out of doing yearly back then. I mean, like you look at like those games and like, I mean, like you play one Mario Party, pretty much played them all, at least from the GameCube. But each one still had like a decent amount of differences, and they were able to pump those out. It just shows like how much quicker game development was back then. Yeah. They were able to put out so much stuff. It is wild. We got like 3 Zelda games on the GameCube. 3 like full-fledged Zelda games if you want to count Four Swords Adventures.
Yeah, I mean, I would, yeah. But Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and then that, those are good. I mean, I think those are some good titles. I'm trying to think of anything really, really, really cheap. Although I might do a video for that at some point. Because I can be like, definitely get Fire Emblem. That's the one to get, and it's like hundreds of dollars. I'm trying to not recommend stuff like that. It's not very approachable.
I'm looking at my collection here. There was. Let me see. I'm just kind of peering through this. This was a good era where I feel like everybody kind of looks back at like a couple licensed games and they're just like, oh yeah, that was the one. You had Simpsons Hit and Run on the GameCube.
Yep.
That was our Grand Theft Auto on the system.
It kind of wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. That was also the Grand Theft Auto I could buy without having to beg my mom to help me buy it for me since it was T-rated. But I have a lot of fun memories of that one. That was a fun one. That I can still probably pop that in now and have a good time with it.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely you can.
Yeah, a lot of people back in the day, people my age, were just like, you had the SpongeBob game, Battle for Bikini Bottom, and that kind of goes along with the Tales of Symphonia remastered one, where I'd say I'd probably prefer playing that on GameCube compared to the modern remake. There are still games that just play really well on that old system. But I'm kind of looking. We got you had like Monkey Ball 1 and 2. You had a weird one, Monkey Ball Adventure. You had you had Beautiful Joe 1 and 2. You had the Capcom 5, which ended up being the Capcom 4, and technically the Capcom 1 because only one of those games remained exclusive. Where Capcom and Nintendo had an exclusivity deal. I don't even think. Was that ever actually a thing, or was that more so something fans coined?
I feel like they actually referenced that in PR.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head, because there was also like Dead Phoenix, which was a game Capcom was working on that was exclusive that they ended up canceling, and pretty much everything but Pino 3 ended up going to other systems. So whatever. But you also had the Pikmin series, you had Animal Crossing, you had like the introduction of series.
That Animal Crossing game's still really good. You know, things like 64 megabytes or something like that too. 32 megabytes.
Yeah.
It's a little game. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, are there any games that you remember from the GameCube that really aren't that great?
Like
as in like, oh man, these like as in what were some stinkers on the system? What do you say?
That's a good question. What were some really bad games? I will say the Call of Duty games back then, kind of rough.
Ooh, no. Big Red One? Finest Hour?
I can play them now. It's kind of rough to play those.
Well, those are like those weird like console versions back when Call of Duty was still kind of a PC-only franchise. And they were kind of done by like not even B teams. I think they were like C teams. They were just done by these other developers. Have you ever seen World at War Final Fronts on PS2?
Oh, no, I've not seen that one. Is it bad?
Yeah, it's just a weird one where it's just like, why even bother? Why are you doing that? And that's kind of what the console versions kind of feel like back during that generation. But I know one off the top of my head. There was a Nintendo published Mickey Mouse game called Disney's Magical Mirror, starring Mickey Mouse. It was developed by Capcom, and it is like one of the simplest point-and-click games ever. I didn't even know it was a point-and-click game. I assumed it was a platformer. It was published by Nintendo. They showed it off during like the reveal of the GameCube at like E3 2001. Just with like a little cinematic and whatnot, that was pretty bad. I think IGN gave it like a 4.5 out of 10, which was shockingly low for like a Nintendo published game at the time. But that's one off the top of my head.
I think I remember I rented Evolution Skateboarding. I'm looking at it now up there on the shelf, and that the controls are really bad in that game. Like especially coming from Tony Hawk Pro Skater, but you could skate as Solid Snake in the game.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, wasn't that the Konami skateboarding game?
That was the redeeming factor, and why I'll always recommend it to people because you could skateboard as Snake.
Yeah,
that was it.
What about did you ever play the EA Sports games that included the Nintendo characters as
I didn't.
A bonus?
I never played that. There was like Street, right? NBA Street
V3, and then SSX, not Tricky.
On Tour, I think, had them snowboarding, right?
Yeah, and then there was also Fight Night Round 2 with Little Mac.
I definitely didn't play Fight Night Round 2, but that sounds awesome. I remember Street.
And you could also play Super Punch Out as a in like you could just go into the menus and play Super Punch Out from the Super Nintendo.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
That was pretty wild. Cool. There's some.
I didn't know that. I might have to look into that now. Huh.
That is one to get. He also looks absolutely disgusting in the game.
Does he?
It's like an EA created model. It's also not like the Little Mac most people like would think, like the guy with the black tank top and the black haircut. No, it's the Super Punch Out version, which has green hair and just this messed up looking face. It's pretty good. I like it.
I have to look that up even on YouTube just to see.
Yeah, I'd say SSX on Tour feels the most like natural with like the Mario characters snowboarding in that one. NBA Street V3 just feels weird.
It's funny because they're like half the height of everyone else.
They're like mascot characters too, like just the big heads and all of that. It's pretty interesting. But I'm looking. I mean, like they had some interesting third-party releases. They had Smuggler's Run. War Zones, which was a version of like Smuggler's Run 2, and I think that was like the only Rockstar game published on the GameCube.
Yeah,
It was
There weren't many, unfortunately.
yeah. It's just it's weird to see like the like oh man they had to pick one Rockstar game to put on the GameCube. Kind of like with the Switch.
Not Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah, kind of like with the Switch for a while there. The only thing we ever got was LA Noire, where it's just like hey I'm happy this is here, but it's just like if you're gonna try anything. Why not do Grand Theft Auto?
They did, and then it was broken as anything now.
Yeah, so now I'm really sad. But
man.
there's also like obviously the mainstays, Super Mario Sunshine. That's still a fantastic game. I know a lot of people, it's kind of the
People don't like
debated,
this game.
It's the debated one.
You know what? Here's what I think the issue is. All right, I think the game's just too hard for some people.
It's a little tricky.
I think some people are just need to get more in tune with their GameCube controller. Maybe
it's a little tricky. I wouldn't blame people. I think the game is not perfect. It is a flawed Mario game, but it is pretty good. It is still quite good. Just the feel, just the control, just feels so good, and that kind of goes into the controller of the GameCube. Genuinely, it is still one of my favorite controllers. It is like a controller that, like, even looking at like some of the best controllers nowadays, for some reason the GameCube one still just feels like natural in the hands. It just feels like everything just like you don't have to think about it. It doesn't feel like you could ever cramp up using the GameCube controller. It feels so natural.
They got the ergonomics like dead on with this controller, absolutely. And they followed up with the Wavebird, which is a fantastic controller. I know there's no rumble to it, but rumble even then was kind of like it's not like rumble now where you have the Switch and the PS5 doing some cool things. So I feel like people could take it or leave it at that time, but like the Wavebird, you never really had to change out the batteries. I think I changed the batteries in mine 2 or 3 times over the entirety of the life of the system I played it, and it's just kept that same ergonomic feel, and it's a good controller. The only thing that would always get me is that D-pad. Little blister inducing if you had to use it too much, but it was within reach, and it worked for selecting items or different things in the game or going through an inventory. But otherwise, the joystick I still think is like the best feeling in the entire generation there with the left stick. And when you first look at the button layout, it's kind of weird because it's this big A button, X and Y circles around, and this little B button, but it works.
Yeah,
I don't know. It just functions well.
It does work very well. I think the idea behind the controller's button layout is really cool because it's something where you don't have to ever really look down, other than using like X or Y buttons. I think those are like the only ones where I'm like, if I could maybe change something, I would be like, oh, maybe make the X and Y buttons more distinct from each other, because I think maybe sometimes I may mix them up.
Yep.
I'm just kind of hypothetically thinking. I can't really think of a time where I'm like, oh man, like that really messed me up. Like, no, I'm just kind of thinking. But I think it's really cool because no matter what, you don't have to look down at the controller. You know exactly where the A and B buttons are, at the very least. You can just feel around, you know what they are. But I will say the button layout does make it kind of hard. I feel like I mentioned this in like 20 videos I've produced, but it's just the idea of like, when you use a GameCube controller on like the Wii for like virtual console games on the Super Nintendo, it gets a little funky with that button layout, but it works for the most part. But overall, I think while it does have some shortcomings, I think the ergonomics and the feel of like the buttons, the joystick, or the thumbsticks, it is second to none. Like the PlayStation controllers are always fine. I think they're fine. And they recently got like really like, I think the DualSense controller feels fantastic.
I think it's a great controller.
Yeah, I think it feels fantastic. The DualShock 4, have you felt like, I felt like when I first put my hands on the DualShock 4, I was like, this is a great controller. But as the generation went on, I became less and less enthusiastic about it. I kind of felt a little more annoyed at that controller.
The reason I think for that is because the time the 6-axis, but the DualShock 3 just, I don't think that was a great controller, really, especially that 6-axis. It felt like a toy compared to the premium $600 console that they released then. So going from that to the DualShock 4, I think was a big enough jump to where you had that honeymoon phase that was extended a bit. And then as time went on, like you're saying, it kind of weared off a bit. And you're like, I don't know about this controller. And then we get the DualSense, and now it's like, oh, this is a good controller.
Just feels very meaty in the hands. It just has a good weight to it. Good feel of the buttons, all that.
kind of a similar situation though with Nintendo, because that 64 controller is an abomination, and I mean that should have been it for Nintendo right there. But then they come back with the GameCube controller. It is tremendously better, like way better than what we had with the N64.
It is fantastic, and it is the controller that won't die. The fact that like Smash Brothers fans, even casual hardcore, like it's like they're just like I don't want to play with anything but. And honestly, like playing, like Smash Brothers Brawl, Wii U, Ultimate, all of those with anything but a GameCube controller, it works. It works perfectly fine. Like those games do not need the GameCube controller. But when I play those games with a GameCube controller, it just feels so much better.
And Nintendo still produces it. Like they themselves produce the GameCube controller still.
And it's
you can go
really
into the store
cool
and buy it.
that you can actually use it via numerous games. Pretty much any game that you can kind of cheese your way through it with a GameCube controller on the Nintendo Switch with the GameCube adapter.
Well, some games will actually make like control schemes for the GameCube controller, and which one was it? There's a racing game, and I know I covered it. They used the GameCube. I think it might have been Grid, but they use the GameCube controller for the acceleration because it has those analog triggers.
Yeah, and Nintendo themselves, they updated Mario Sunshine and Mario 3D All Stars.
Yeah,
just something that just feels it's just like, why would they do that? It's just like this game that they might have already took it down by the time they updated it from what I remember.
I like to think sometimes there are just old people in Nintendo who are nostalgic like us, and they're like, I'm gonna patch this thing. This is getting dumb.
Yeah.
I just like to imagine that in my mind that happens inside Nintendo.
Yeah, but overall, I think like the library just it did have some gaps, but I think there's always something. I feel like there's always something new to discover on the GameCube. You have all the Resident Evil games pretty much at the time, all the main ones, which is just like, okay, like this was a series that was born on PlayStation. It almost would have made more sense if it was like the Metal Gear games, just because like, well, Metal Gear 1 kind of had like the NES version, so it's just like it kind of has Nintendo roots. But like Resident Evil, like it was always just a PS1 game or a series that was really just made its home on PS1. And then like boom, all the games are on GameCube. And then you had Sega with all the Sonic games. Like I think Sonic has so much of its fan base today that discovered that series from all those games on GameCube. Adventure 2, Heroes, all of that stuff. Even if like you can look back at those and be like, like be more critical of them. I think that was a good era for that series. I think, like even if, some of those games don't hold up that well, I think it was still kind of a very positive era for that series and kind of, got a lot of fans for that franchise. And, you have... It was very weird that like the Mega Man X games were still exclusive to PlayStation for the most part. I found that very strange.
Oh, you mean like the later ones? Because we had like the X Collection on the Switch.
We had the Collection and Command Mission.
Yeah, Command Mission was a strange one, yeah. And we had that Network Transmission game.
Network Transmission, which was pretty much like combining like Battle Network and kind of a little bit of classic Mega Man. But it was very strange.
The good news is X7 and X8 are not very good games. So there you go.
X8's okay. It's not that bad. I mean, it's better. It's better than X7.
The one thing I was really annoying, by the way, is they did the Mega Man collection on the GameCube, the PS2, and the Xbox,
the A and
right?
B swap. Are you going to say how they swapped the buttons on that collection?
No, I remember me and my buddy both picked it up. He got it on the PS2. I got it on the GameCube. The GameCube version of the Mega Man collection does not have what the PS2 does, which is an entire episode from the series on the disc that you unlock. The GameCube did not get that because it has a mini DVD. So they gave us like some wallpaper stuff or something. I don't know. It was really annoying. I was like, you get an entire episode? What?
They did that with a couple of games. Like I remember like it's just like, oh, the PS2 version has an opening cinematic and this and that. And it's weird because like, history repeats itself. I can kind of recall like Team Sonic Racing on Nintendo Switch. Like that game on PS4 and Xbox One had like an opening cutscene, but on Switch it doesn't because they were like, size limitations. Like it's just like, boom. And it just kind of felt like, oh man, I remember these days. But what I was saying was like the Mega Man Anniversary Collection on GameCube. Like they swapped the buttons. Jump is B and shoot is A.
Yeah, that was weird.
I'm just like,
that was a strange one.
I don't get this, man. This is disgusting. But I mean, just to wrap it up with like some other major title, the Pokemon. It was so interesting to see, like, they kind of tried like a home console Pokemon game, not really, but still kind of, with like Coliseum and XD just having like these full blown. They were basically full blown RPGs in the Pokemon universe. They weren't actual mainline Pokemon games. They weren't developed by Game Freak. But it's very strange because Game Freak was always very adamant. They were like, no, Pokemon's a handheld series. Like, you need it on the handheld. It makes more sense to put the party games or something or little spin-offs on the console. But here we have, like, games that are full-fledged RPGs. They may not be full-fledged Pokemon games. They're pretty much RPGs set in the Pokemon universe. They're very strange.
XD was an interesting one. I remember the story with that is like the Pokemon were being turned even or something, and I think they had like 60 some odd Pokemon in that game. But I remember getting that game and I was like, this is kind of strange to be playing this on the TV. I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but it was different. I liked seeing the fully rendered 3D Pokemon game there as opposed to when we were playing them on the Game Boy. I think I was playing Gold and Silver at the time, right? And it was much different seeing them up on the big screen going through a story with a little character and stuff. So it was
but it kind of felt like that was maybe there was like some urgency to be like, we got to try to make the GameCube work. Maybe let's try to do like a Pokemon, like a kind of an RPG.
That's a good point.
I always kind of felt like maybe there was like a push to do that where it's just like, all right, well, let's do something that kind of looks and feels like a traditional Pokemon game. Because Pokemon Coliseum, the way that was like, branded and shown, it very much feels like this is the GameCube follow-up to Pokemon Stadium. Which is what it was.
Right.
But Pokemon XD, while it's a follow-up to Coliseum, just the way, like, the title looks and the box art, it looks like a traditional Pokemon game. Like, it looks like something that you'd see and, like, that it looks like a regular Pokemon box art with, like, what is it, Lugia or something? I don't know what that thing is on the box art. I'm trying to sound like I know what I'm saying, but either way, it looks like a traditional Pokemon game, which it kind of feels like maybe Nintendo was like, come on, let's try this. But yeah, they had like. I mean, we could go on and on. You have Kirby Air Ride. You have all the 007 games.
Agent Under Fire. That was a good one. That was everything that you would do something cool and it would play the 007 theme every time. It was like the soundbite that would constantly play. And when you're like 4 hours of the game, you're just, all right, I've heard that enough. Thank you.
Well, I bought a lot of, I think I bought all the 007 games for GameCube just because they're all really cheap. And I've been also buying a lot of stuff on GameCube mainly because like when I have people over, the immediate like thing that they do is like they check out like the game collection, and if they're here long enough to like play a game, GameCube's still like one of the easiest things to be like, hey, you want to play multiplayer? Let's play on the GameCube kind of thing.
Yep.
Like it's one of the easiest things. And it doesn't even matter if a lot of games on GameCube, like some of these are like not great. Like a lot of like people my age remember like some random like licensed games or a lot of random multiplayer games on here. So I've just been buying a lot of stuff, and I thought, hey, the 007 games, like I do miss like getting those 007 games because like it was nice to always have kind of like first person shooters that were still like didn't take themselves too seriously. It was just like kind of like a little colorful, something T-rated, but still were like serious enough where it didn't feel like you were playing something as a joke. But it's just a little more lighthearted than like a gritty Call of Duty or something. It's just nice to have that.
I think now a lot of places are concerned that if they put the budget out for it, it'll feel like it's too generic or something. It has to be this cinematic, first-person, gritty kind of shooter. It seems to be at least the way it's trending with costs around production for these games. I think you could still have something like that, like a fun arcadey 007 style shooter that's maybe 8 to 10 hour campaign, and that's sort of it. And I feel like you could still put it out there for $40 or $50 and people would be interested.
Yeah, exactly. But overall, I mean, we didn't even mention a lot of the stuff like, like a lot of the more weird games, Chibi Robo, Custom Robo, Geist, Nintendo dipping into M-rated games with Eternal Darkness and Geist.
Trying to get Chibi Robo. That game's got way too expensive, by the way.
Yeah, I got Chibi Robo back when it was still kind of expensive, but before it got too expensive.
Some of these games I remember seeing on shelves for $40, like not when the system was new or anything, but 10 years ago. These games were very cheap.
I remember seeing like Cubivore at
Oh gosh.
at like an old game store that I frequented for like years. Like I would see it, and it was like $60, and I was like, not today. But now it's like, how much is that game? Like $300-$400?
It's $400 or $500. It's a lot. That's the one that I wish I had picked up because it's from Atlas, and it's interesting to have that on the GameCube. So someday.
It's technically like a Nintendo game, but it was published by Atlas over here. Like I think there's trophies for it in Smash Brothers Melee. It was developed by like Intelligent Systems, so like it's a very oddball game.
It's an interesting collaboration of companies for that one.
Yeah. But yeah, overall, like there's so many games on the GameCube that like didn't even mention, but it just shows like there's just never-ending stuff to talk about with this system. I think it is my favorite because it just felt like Nintendo was firing at all cylinders. I feel like they were kind of like putting out like the best versions of their franchises at the time, you know, like it didn't really feel like downgrades where, you know, Nintendo's doing very well with the Nintendo Switch right now, but it does feel like some franchises are kind of like, you know, it's like, oh, Paper Mario, the Origami King. Well, you know, hey, you know, it's fine. You know, the Mario Sports title is like, okay, well, the gameplay's okay, but you know, the content's not there, and it just kind of feels like a lot of games like that. It just feels like it's cool that we're getting new entries and these are quality enough, but on the GameCube, it didn't really feel like we were kind of making do with what we were getting at the time. It kind of feels like, hey, this is like the best new version of this game from this beloved series. And we got pretty much all the games from all the series. The only one that we kind of didn't really get was Kirby, and even then we got Kirby Air Ride. But you know, no traditional game. But hey, like a couple were in development, but they eventually just moved to Wii. But overall, like that's why it's like my favorite. I feel like it had like this great balance of like enough games to play, and this just kind of this communal feeling. The Wii U had not enough games to play at all. Kind of had a communal feeling like owning a Wii U and just seeing everybody suffering with you. But the GameCube at least had like, all right, all the games were great. You had a decent amount of third-party support, not a ton, but still like enough to kind of at least keep you going. And the games Nintendo was putting out were like second to none. Like some of the best, maybe not like genre defining as like, oh, like Mario Sunshine was not as revolutionary or amazing as Mario 64 was at the time, but it was still a great entry in that series. And I think that's potentially why the GameCube just didn't take off that much, because like Nintendo didn't really have that major game that was like, wow, this is revolutionary and everybody needs to see this. Metroid Prime could have been that, but the Metroid series would never like, it's never like, oh my god, you know, everybody can play this, everybody enjoys this kind of thing. So I don't know. It's a shame that it didn't get the respect it deserved at the time, but I feel like people are starting to realize that now, and it is unfortunate because that means I am severely in debt with how much I've been buying.
It was an interesting time in gaming. I think it was fun to see some of the transitions they made from the Nintendo 64 to the GameCube, especially with visuals, and it was a big deal when the characters had fingers all of a sudden. You know, it was like, wow, this is incredible. But I think for the most part, it was a shame to look back on that GameCube, because I feel like that's when Nintendo was really, as you say, firing on all cylinders. They had it, I think, more in tune with I'm going to say the hardcore Nintendo gamer, whereas the following generation, they went to the Wii, and they kind of lost track of that a bit and went more mainstream with it. But it worked for them. So that was at least good, and I'd like them to remember their legacy at the GameCube a bit more. Maybe not this generation with the Switch, but the following generation, and add it into their subscription service and start pulling from that library of titles that younger gamers now can try out on their new system, because it is hard to tell people to go get a GameCube and just start building up a library with where prices are. So new ways for people to play these games, I think, would be the next best thing. So here's hoping Nintendo does that in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, I'll at least extend it further. I'm hopeful in the next 30 years.